Okay, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched season 3 of Jujutsu Kaisen and at some point just caught yourself thinking, wait, what is actually happening right now? Not in a this is complex, I need to think way, but in a very basic, almost frustrating way where you feel like you're losing this thread of the story itself. Because I had that exact reaction. And when I started watching it, I didn't like it at all, to be honest. It was a very weird feeling because I wanted to like it and I said, maybe I'm missing something there. So I started doing something that I almost never do while watching a story. I went to Google. I started looking up explanations, characters, motivations, trying to piece things together. And then I started noticing something very interesting. I saw the same confusion in comments on Reddit, in Instagram, in different discussions. People rereading chapters, watching breakdowns, and still not understanding what's going on. And this problem affected not only casual viewers, but also those fans who delve deeply into the lore. And when that kind of confusion happens on a large scale, it usually means one thing. It's not a viewer problem, it's a storytelling problem. Because a story, no matter how complex, should always answer three simple questions. Who is it about? What do they want and why it matters? And if the audience has to live this story just to understand it and to Google it, something in the storytelling already broke. And here is the key part. It's not that the story is too complex. It's that the story stops guiding you through that complexity. At some point, Jujutsu Kaisen stops answering that clearly, and before we go any further, if you ever felt this but couldn't explain it, subscribe, because I'm going to break down exactly where stories start to fall apart. By the way, this court is now officially in session. Today we are officially putting Gege Kutami and Mappa Studio on trial for crimes against narrative structure. Now here is the important part. This story didn't start broken. In fact, in season 1 and even the most of season 2, Jujutsu Kaisen always feels very coherent. You have a clear entry point into the world through Yuji, and through him you are introduced to a very simple but compelling concept of power. For example, what do you do when you are given a kind of power that isn't really yours? And the story keeps returning us to this question about power again and again in different ways and settings. You see it through Yuji and Sukuna, you see it through Yuta, and even through Satoru, who represents the extreme ends of what overwhelming power actually means. At the same time, there is another layer quietly building in the background, the idea that the Jujutsu system itself is kind of flawed, that something about the way this world is structured doesn't really work. And that's where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because it introduces a real ideological conflict through Satoru and Geto. Two people who started in the same place and connected with each other, but in the end came to completely different conclusions about what should be done with that system. And that's a very strong narrative engine, and it was the strongest conflict in this anime, and as we see, it was never about curses at all. And when that conflict disappears, the story loses its emotional core, because it was very clear, it was personal, and it gave the story direction. And all of this builds into Shibuya incident, which honestly feels like a proper culmination of everything that came before it. Because Shibuya works exactly the way a good story climax should work. You can feel the escalation, you understand what's at stake, you know who is fighting and why, and there is a very real sense that something important is about to change. You're not just watching events here, you're following a story that's moving towards something. And then we enter the next arc. And this is exactly where things start to break structurally, not suddenly, not in one specific scene, but very gradually, in a way that almost hard to pinpoint at first. Because the story doesn't just become bigger, it becomes very, very different. We move into the Culling Game, and the narrative starts to feel less like a story driven by conflict and more like a system you are supposed to understand. And this is a course shift. Instead of events leading to consequences, we get mechanics leading to encounters. As for me, while I was watching this, my first question was, why is this all happening? Why? The structure became not deep but very overloaded, and you completely lose the narrative itself. There are tons of rules, points, barriers, colonies, constantly introduce mechanics, new characters appearing one after another, and while each individual element can be explained, the overall experience becomes harder and harder to follow. And this is where I feel like the story kind of looks at you and goes, okay, good luck. And maybe on paper, this whole setup is actually very ambitious. It's framed as a large scale ritual orchestrated by Kenjaku with the goal of reshaping humanity itself. Okay, that's a huge idea. Sounds cool, right? But the problem is, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like a ritual, like Welcome to Hunger Games Cursed Edition, because the antagonist Kenjaku has a goal that is conceptually interesting. The idea itself is big, but it has quite weak emotional connect to the characters we are following. It's not just I want to change the world because I suffered or something like this. It's more like I want to see what happens. That's not tension, that's like just a curiosity. But I think we should discuss the problem of antagonists and protagonists in the separate video, because there are lot more to discuss. Here's where the disconnect happens. The story tells you this is a ritual, something building toward a massive transformation, right? But what you experience as a viewer feels much closer to a battle royale structure, where events are driven by encounters and fights rather than a clear progression toward a defined outcome. So, what do we end up with a mismatch between what the story promises and how it actually functions. And when those two things don't align, when this concept says one thing but the structure feels like something else, the narrative starts to lose its clarity. And that's when you begin to notice something else. You are not really following the story anymore, but you are trying to keep up with how the system works. Which brings us to one of the core problems. When a story becomes too focused on mechanics, on how things work, it often starts to lose sight of why those things matter. And that's why is exactly what keeps the audience emotionally engaged. Because without it, even the most visually impressive sequence can feel empty and meaningless. And this also affects pacing in a very noticeable way. Everything in this season is happening too way fast and without enough space for the audience to process it. Events begin to happen very quickly. New characters are introduced and removed before you can really understand them. Major moments don't have enough time to land emotionally. Even death or turning points don't always carry the way they should. And without that space, the audience simply cannot form an emotional connection. This is another reason why the story is now less emotionally engaging. We can't fully connect with the heroes to experience the moment of triumphant revenge or the death of a character who has been with us, excuse me, since the very first season. And yes, I'm talking about Masamichi Yaga now. I would like to discuss Hiromi Higuruma separately because he is the only one interesting new character in this season, and there is very exciting evidence why. At the same time, some of the most interesting things the story sets up earlier, like the idea of a broken system and the need to change it, starts to fade into the background. They're not completely gone, but they are no longer driving the narrative in the same way. They are introduced but not fully developed or resolved. And instead of developing that conflict further and deeper, the story shifts its focus towards the mechanic of the game itself. And when you put all of these together, you start to see the bigger picture now. Jujutsu Kaisen didn't become confusing because it aimed too high or that they added more fights themselves. It became confusing because it lost the clear narrative center that was holding everything together. And once that center is gone, complexity doesn't feel like depth anymore. It just feels like noise. If you've ever felt that shift while watching or reading this arc but couldn't quite explain it, consider subscribing because this is just the first case we are discussing. The court finds the defendant guilty. Not of having bad ideas or adding more fights, but of losing the story that made those ideas meaningful. Sentence, narrative inconsistency. Court is adjourned for now. And now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I need your help. Who are we putting on trial next? Feel free to drop your suggestions in the comments, because this court is just getting started.